Great. So first on the agenda, I wanted to present on my progress on the IAM account feature. I have several links here. Um, the gist one is kind of just an overview that I'll be going through. And I'll try to keep it to 30 minutes or so that we have time for everything else. So the links are the pull request, the S3 tests, the outline, and then a link to the docs that are work in progress there. So the gist here is basically just the outline. I want to talk about uh, what it is and why, and then get into kind of the shape of the implementation. The PR has a lot of commits, so trying to just give an overview first. So just to start with the very basic, what is IAM? It's a service in AWS for identity and access management. It's their way to create users and access keys and set policies on things. Um, they have a dashboard on their website when you log in with your account, but they also provide REST APIs with all of that same functionality. And so it's the REST API that this PR aims to implement. With the API in place, we could add functionality to the Ceph dashboard to give a GUI kind of like Amazon. But to start, this is just the REST APIs so that you can use a tool like AWS CLI, for example, to create users, add access keys, attach policies. And so the reason that accounts are important is because the account is the thing that owns all of this state. When you log in to AWS, you only see the users and stuff for your own account, and you have full control over that stuff, but not anybody else's. So in Ceph, before accounts, the cluster admin basically has to create all of the users, manage all of the policies and roles. And for big service providers, this doesn't scale very well. And it also doesn't give the end users full control over IAM identity policies. So with accounts, all the admin has to do is create an account and an account root user with Rados GW admin, and they can hand off those credentials to the end user, for example, a team or an organization, and they can use the account root user to create their own users, roles, and add whatever policy they want, all within the context of their own account. So that's the goal. For backward compatibility, the account feature is entirely optional. Users will continue to work the same way if they're not in an account. And if you want to add them to accounts, you can, and they'll behave differently. So Preetha has already done a lot of work on IAM APIs, which I'm calling the tenant-based ones. We already support roles, role policy, user policy, and OpenID Connect, but the resources themselves are tenant-wide. So all users in a tenant see the same rules and OIDC providers. Other big difference is that admin capabilities are required to use these. Either an admin user or admin capabilities like roles or user policy. And the policies that you can apply through the tenant-based API follow the rules of policy evaluation within a single account. They don't support cross-account policy, which I'll talk about more. And effectively, that means that they can grant full read and write permissions on all users' resources instead of just within an account. So the next section talks about kind of the differences with the account-based APIs that I've added in the PR. Here, all of the resources, users, roles, groups are scoped to the account, and you only view and modify those belonging to your account. And it's the account root user that has access. You don't need an admin user or permissions to do it. That admin or the account root user can grant access to other users or groups or roles in the account with more policy. In addition to the role policy stuff that we already support, this adds support for the user access key group policy APIs. And these are only supported in the account-based version, not the tenant-wide one. And another thing that I added was support for managed policies. They're kind of named policies like Amazon S3 full access and read-only access that are really easy to attach to users or groups or roles. And they kind of give kind of canned policy similar to canned ACLs. There are similar ones for the IAM, SNS, and STS APIs also. But the users created by the IAM API are pretty much normal RGW users. The only difference is that they have an account ID set. And that's what makes all the difference in policy evaluation and visibility in the IAM APIs. So going into permissions and policies, the account root user is special, and then it has default access to all of the account's resources. The non-root users, as they do in Amazon, start with no permissions at all. So you have to add some kind of policy before they're authorized to do essentially anything that's even within the same account. And then there are special cross-account policy rules that apply when you try to access things owned by other accounts. This requires that an identity policy within the account grants resource or grants access, and also that a resource policy like bucket policy or ACLs also grants specific access to the requesting account. So it's these rules that are a big difference between the account-based APIs and the existing tenant ones. And lastly, assume role behaves a little differently with accounts in that resources created, like bucket creation, created under an assumed role, become owned by the roles account instead of the initial user. And that also determines whether cross-account or single account policy evaluation applies. So before I move on to the implementation, any questions about this first part?
I'm not 100% sure how it plays with the existing tenant mechanism that we have. I mean, tenants are sort of, have some overlap with accounts, but how do they currently play together if we have both tenants and accounts?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would describe tenants is that it's only a namespace prefix. So it's about isolation of bucket names and usernames, for example. Um, the work that we've done already on the tenant-based IAM kind of turns it more into like an account management kind of thing. But I think the account-based APIs do that in a better way because of the scoping to accounts. But all of the existing tenant stuff plays just fine with accounts. You create an account in a tenant. It can be the default tenant or a named one. And all of the buckets that you can see are scoped to the tenant. And
the account name itself is also scoped to the tenant?
Accounts, I did add an account name, but AWS doesn't really have account names. They have account IDs.
Right.
And the account IDs in this implementation are globally unique, not scoped to tenants.
Okay. But the users inside the account, they follow the same kind of per tenant scoping, right?
Yes. To add a user to an account, the user has to have the same tenant name as the account.
Okay.
So accounts are also scoped by tenant, like to follow up to Yuval's question. So, and also, let's say if an organization, you kind of answered that organization already implemented tenant-based IAM, the migration to account would be seamless, right? As far as I understand your answer.
Fairly seamless, yes. I think the process would be that you create accounts and you can migrate existing users into the accounts. That way they can start managing their own policies, but existing policies should continue to work. For example, policies added by the tenant role policy or user policy APIs.
And similar to AWS, the bucket names would be globally unique across accounts?
Yes, that's correct. We also have the tenant namespacing feature, which gives distinct bucket namespaces, but accounts created in the same tenant will have the same globally unique bucket names.
Got it. So it won't follow the current RGW multi-tenancy scoping. It'll follow what one would expect similar to AWS if you're building a cluster from scratch and using accounts. It'll ensure that all the buckets are unique across accounts.
Well, yeah, it's kind of both. If you create accounts in the same tenant, then it looks like AWS. But if you create them in separate tenants, then they get their own separate views.
Got it. Sounds
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Any other questions?
So just to follow up on that, let's say two accounts. If we create a bucket in default tenant, it has to be unique, right? Like two accounts cannot create a bucket with the same name in default tenant.
That's right.
Okay, just
So you can in fact have multi-tenancy without tenants.
I mean, at least in terms of
I'm just teasing. Yeah.
separate accounts, right? But they'd still share bucket namespaces.
Sure. I was just joking that AWS is in fact multi-tenant, despite the fact that they have a single bucket namespace.
But AWS sounds kind of lame.
Yeah, they have 100 trillion objects, so it's working.
All right, so in this next section, I'll do my best to kind of give a shape of the implementation. There's a lot of commits, but they're mostly focused around these sections. The first one was kind of the most invasive to the code base, and that's an abstraction for ownership, so that things like buckets and ACLs can be owned either by a user or by an account ID. So this is how existing tenant users work and how we can support ownership by accounts in the new model. So this is called the RGW owner type, and it's a standard variant. And so all the code that cares about ownership has to go through the authenticating identity instead of through the SAL user. And so it's this auth identity that takes on some new responsibilities for managing accounts and ownership. That's how we implement the assume role change, so that resources from assumed roles belong to their own account instead of the assuming user. So in addition to that, a lot of ACL stuff, but major metadata changes with the addition of the account metadata. There's an RGW account info similar to bucket info and other metadata that gets stored in an account object in this accounts pool. There's a name object for lookups, and then there are several indexes for the accounts buckets, users, roles, and groups. And these are mainly for servicing APIs like list users, list roles, etc. Then there's new group metadata, looks very similar, has an index of users that belong to the group for the get group API. So metadata sync for this was a little complicated, since metadata sync just transfers the metadata itself. And so behind the scenes, we have to make sure that all of the indexes get updated, but that's all tested and working. I guess other metadata like buckets also have a account ID in them, and that's how the buckets index gets updated, for example. Same with user and role. And then I'd say a lot of the rest of the work is just around updating the REST APIs and adding the new ones. So we already have the role, user policy, OpenID Connect stuff in existing files. I did some refactoring around that first, and then added account support, which was fairly easy. Basically, if it belongs to an account, then it follows the account root user permissions. Otherwise, it requires the admin capabilities. And then there's a set of new files for the new APIs group, user access key, and an admin API for account metadata itself. So that's kind of an outline of the shape of the PR. There's a detailed to-do list in the PR's description here. Most everything is done except for topics and a couple of test things. But it is a lot of commits, and so I'm really looking for volunteers to help with review. My impression is that it's feature complete. There's more that I'd like to do for docs and testing, but it's certainly ready for review. And the timing is a little bit close for Squid, but if somebody is willing to step up and help review it, then I think it could potentially make it. Let's see, there's also the PR for S3 tests where we add sections for the IAM root user credentials and an alt root, basically so that we can test the cross-account functionality. And then there's full coverage of all of the APIs that are added. I also shared a link to the docs, kind of giving an overview of how the account management, account creation, policy stuff works. And there's some examples of using AWS CLI to create users and stuff. There was an example of that in the gist also. But I think that's about all I wanted to cover. Happy to answer more questions, but really just looking for somebody to help out with review.
Is there any plan to backport this to RIP after making this available in Squid?
I really don't think so. Hundreds of commits. If it doesn't make Squid, I wouldn't want to backport it to Squid either.
Casey, I will step up and commit to start doing review today. If you will paste me a link in Slack.
And I have to say that latter point. I mean, I agree with on Reef, but I think this really wants to be in Squid for various reasons. I mean, we have to put extra work into helping to make that happen. It would be a long time, in other words, a full year before anyone could then use accounts, and I think that would be too much pressure to sustain.
I would be very, very happy to step up and do review. I will start today.
Adam, you are my hero.
Just paste me the link in Squid, and I will, or the link in Slack, and I will get to it.
I mean, I sure will.
In terms of review, do you have to review the whole thing, or is it possible to review it chunk by chunk, while or on some subcomponent you're specialized in, while kind of glancing at the rest of it? Like I could take a look at the admin API stuff that you changed.
If you're specialized in a component, look at it and see if you can find any failures or any infelicities.
I mean, I already reviewed the zipper parts, so
okay.
By all means, if you think you know a particular subset, look it over.
One part that I haven't quite finished is the Toothology integration. So if anybody would like to help with that, then it would be great. We can discuss that more later, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say, you probably haven't written any admin API related tests for it yet, because I think you mentioned you haven't done a lot on testing yet.
Well, I've done a ton of testing, but the only new admin APIs are for creation of accounts. And yeah, I didn't add any test coverage for that. But in terms of people's expertise, I think Preetha mainly is the one that I would love to hear from about the auth changes in particular, and I guess the policy evaluation stuff.
I mean, have you reached out to
I'll do that, Casey.
Or you're here? Okay.
I'm here, Matt. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent.
I had a question on assume role, Casey. So the changes that you're saying, the ownership that has changed from user to auth identity, does that apply to assume role with web identity also?
I guess I'm not sure where the difference was. I think my changes were in the role applier to return the.
Okay. Yeah, so it will apply to web identity also. The reason why I'm asking is because we create shadow users for a web identity, and it was only for this purpose for managing the resources under that user. So now since you've shifted all the resource management to accounts, maybe that could be looked into. So
Cool.
I think that's true, right? Because in AWS, if you assume role, then the resources that are created by that principal are owned by the account of the assumed role, right? So if you create a role under account XYZ, and then there, somebody assumes that role, then the any resources that are created, like buckets or policies or anything like that, those are owned by the parent account, not by something like a shadow user, right? Because yeah.
So that was definitely the goal. I touched on this before, talking about the auth identity. RGW still has kind of a big dependence on being able to fill in the S user, which is our user zipper handle. And so we might still need a shadow user just for that. But I mean, ideally, I think it would be great to move away from needing a user for every request, but that would be a bigger project, I think.
Karitha, can you remind me, there was a concept that came up when we were doing initial work with assume role with identity, environments that requested specifically to have the ability to have traceability of who had done who had created like certain objects and so forth. And if we completely erase the shadow user, how would we be able to capture that in some way outside of like the ops log?
We had decided the role to be the owner of the resources, but that didn't work out because we needed some kind of stats for the end user. I remember, and for that reason, we decided to have something like a shadow user.
I think. Go ahead. Sorry, Kyle.
Oh, I was going to say that there is this notion of assumed role session name, and I think the intent with that is you can name a session so that you can track operations over that session. But like the resources that are created are not owned by the session, but it does help facilitate tracking.
Yeah, I think this came up very, very early, so I think we would like to capture that. Yeah, it's absolutely the case. And there was no argument by any of these folks, nor by me now, that the ownership should be something there in that. So there should be no reason to have things to have such a thing as a shadow user. But if that refactoring can be done, but it would be helpful to think through that tracking concept and try to incorporate it.
Yeah, I'll go through that part of the PR. I mean, other parts also, but this is one thing that came to my mind. Listening to Casey's talk about user shift to auth identity. And also one more question, Casey, now that we can, shift users, the RGW local users to IAM users, you said that they won't have any policy by default, right? Are we planning to attach any default policies to the existing RGW users that will be migrated to an IAM user, especially for create bucket or
I was not planning to add anything by default. I was planning to just document that in the section about migrating an existing user into an account.
Yeah,
just a note saying that.
I think one of the things that you had said was like an existing user that gets migrated to an account would become analogous to like a root account. And so it was different than if you created, say, it's different than say an IAM user. You can create policies that govern what an IAM user can do, but generally a root user can do any operation, which is why best practice is to create IAM users with narrowly scoped capabilities to use for different applications or to use assume role or something like that.
Okay, yeah, I hadn't planned for the migration to turn them into account root users, but that might be a suggestion. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like if you're migrating several users into one account, you only want one account root. So I think just documenting that adopting a existing user would need to add some policy before they can access things.
Well, I think it's if you have existing users, they're always going to map to root users, and then they could, those root users could be used to create IAM users that are a sub resource of that account, right?
You could do that if you wanted, but existing users don't have the account root flag set. But when migrating them, you could add that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's two different scenarios that we should document then. One where you're taking a user and making an account just for that user where they're the root, and then a separate one where you're migrating several users into an account that maybe already has a root.
Right, because I mean, even if you took all the RGW users today and they become account root users, there are still capabilities that exist for you to grant cross account access if somebody wanted to do that, and then that way you never have to worry about like canonizing one user and then like moving another RGW user in as a sub resource IAM user under that account or something like that. That seems like it would be really aggressive. I don't know if that's what was being suggested, but yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it just deserves two different pieces in the docs for the two uses. Preetha, do you have any more questions? I don't want to keep you too late.
I have one more question. So if we have accounts across two different tenants, are there any restrictions on cross-account access here, or it's just like two different accounts and the tenant doesn't play any role where cross-account access is concerned?
Well, I do think it changes things slightly because if you're trying to access something in another account, usually you reference the other account's roles, right? So I can't create a role that's owned by me that governs my access to Casey's account, right? Casey would need to create a role at his. I would assume role referencing the ARN that is scoped to him, and then that's how and then his policy would dictate whether I'm allowed to do that or not.
Yeah, I think the question was more about when they're in different tenants, if there are differences there, right? And the fact that account IDs are globally unique means that you can refer to cross-tenant ARNs.
Okay.
Which I think accomplishes everything that we wanted to there. You can still use assume role for cross-tenant access.
And even if you have a collision on the bucket names, when you reference a bucket in policy, you would usually use the ARN and the earlier prefix, the account prefix in the ARN would disambiguate which account that bucket name corresponds with.
Right. If you assume a role in a tenant, then you would see that tenant's namespace.
Well, it doesn't matter. Even if you have two buckets named foo, if you refer to them in a policy, you wouldn't refer to bucket foo. I don't think. I think you refer to the ARN of the bucket, which would be something like, account / bucket / foo, right?
I mean, under default tenant, that shouldn't possible, right? Two accounts cannot have the same bucket name. That's what we kind of agreed on.
It's certainly the case now.
Yeah, bucket ARNs are kind of weird. I mean, in Amazon, the tenant field of bucket ARNs is always empty, but RGW does support tenant names there, and I didn't make any changes to that. You still don't refer to buckets by account IDs, but for cross-tenant access, yeah, you would use ARNs with the tenant name in them.
Oh, well, that's a problem. Well, that's a problem for roles at least, because you need to have, because there could potentially be multiple accounts that have the same role. You're going to need to be able to reference, like, right? I need to think about that more. I think it's potentially a problem.
I was talking specifically about bucket ARNs, but role ARNs do have the account ID.
Okay, got it.
So yeah, that disambiguates roles and users, etc. All right, does that answer all your questions, Preetha?
Yeah, yes, Casey. Thank you. I'll look up the PR.
Yep, and there's a lot there, but maybe if you just focus on specific files like RGW auth and RGW common for the policy stuff, then that would make it easier for you to consume.
Okay.
Okay, I still want to leave time for the other agenda topics today. Any other thoughts before we move on?
I actually had one comment regarding testing. So I guess you have coverage for all the new APIs. This is one thing, but can you have like a mode where you just run all the regular S3 tests, but with an account, just to make sure that you have full coverage of everything with accounts?
Yeah, that was part of the plan for the Toothology testing, was to kind of have a matrix of the S3 test users and passing in account users for some of them. But that doesn't work yet. I still need to bash through it.
Okay, I see. I thought that could be even something like global. So to have a root user, and then you just create the users and associate them with the root user of the account, and then you don't need to change anything with the tests. You don't need to select a subset even of the tests. You just need to run it in a different mode.
Yeah. In Toothology, though, it's the S3 tests task that creates all of the users and fills in the S3 test config. So that's where I was making the changes.
Okay.
All right, and Adam, I'll follow up with you offline to get started on review.
Thank you, sir.
All right, then let's move on. Alex had the next topic about replication status.
Yeah, hi everyone. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the potential proposal or design of the AWS replication status headers. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so if you, I think it's loading. Okay, yeah, so if you see my screen, this is the tracker for it. It's about the XAMS replication status option. So it's from the documents. There are 4 specific things we could support for this header. According to AWS, replica is already implemented, so that is for an object that has already been replicated. The other few we need to do to close the feature are pending, failed, and completed. So pending is pretty easy. Completed is sort of like the more difficult one I wanted to discuss. Completed means object has been replicated to all destination zones. So there's some good discussion here, but the original thought here was to do it on a per object basis using bylog, reading bylogs and then making sure everything got replayed from one side to the other. Seemed very expensive based on discussions, so we tried to move to a more bucket level approach. The initial thought being using bylog trimming, and as a result finding the minimum marker in order to determine what the status of a bucket and its replication status of the objects in it are. So this is kind of on the bottom here. It's a very like simple sort of thing. So it's kind of going to be just in time for the first time evaluation of an object has been replicated. So initially an object that gets uploaded by a client gets, and it has destination zones that it knows it needs to be replicated to, we'll get a pending header. So initially, this is kind of going to be an implementation detail we could discuss, but it's going to get the earliest marker that hasn't yet been trimmed. So we could do this looking through the bucket chart, but perhaps we could cache this information somewhere during trimming to make it just a one-time read versus going through all the bucket index shards. But basically, once you get this, you get the time of that marker. So because everything below that has been trimmed, means that it has found it has been determined to be playback on the other few destination zones. And based on how trimming works, it goes through all the destination zones before it can trim. So it means it's showed up and been replayed in the destination zones. So it would get the time of that marker, given that that time, and then we would compare that to the object's time itself. So if the minimum replicated time is greater than the object's upload time, that means that operation has already been sort of completed, and then we can mark that status completed, save that object, save that information as an object attribute, so we don't have to look this up again. Otherwise, that bylog for that object is yet to be trimmed. So it could be replicated, but there's no guarantee yet, and I don't think we want to look up or talk to the destination zones to see if it has happened. So I think it'll sort of be an indeterminate state here until trimming catches up. This is sort of like the high-level overview. There's some, of course, details that we would need to do during implementation, some edge cases, but this is sort of the high level. It would scale to the time of log trimming, but it would be less expensive. So that's sort of the trade-off I think we decided to go with here. Just wanted to open it up for discussion. If anyone has any thoughts on the overall concept, where we maybe should cache this information about the trim time, and yeah, if anyone has any thoughts, comments.
So if an object is uploaded in a zone that is replicating to others, then it gets the indication that it's pending. Is that the case?
Sorry, I didn't understand. So when a client uploads an object, it becomes pending, right?
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then yeah, I mean, that make I think it's. I mean, I'm not sure. Well, I guess we're going to start something in that case. I mean, it makes sense, Well, I guess how you would avoid it. And yeah, I guess you need to update that header if you want to stabilize it. But I mean, so I guess that's so does this header have to be specifically requested, or does it, so that we only have to resynthesize it if someone does that?
So according to what AWS does, it's always returned from a GET or head request.
That seems very expensive itself, but.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it's going to be either way. You're going to have to track a lot of things to get this header to work, but as a part of the standard, I think it should be implemented. This seems like it avoids work for objects. Well, pretty much every object's going to get retrieved.
If you want to enable or disable this as a feature in a particular implementation, is that possible?
I guess we could look into that. I'm not sure AWS has the option for that, but they probably implement replication in a different way. That
I mean,
makes
we're not AWS, so I mean, the
Yeah,
idea that
right.
we have to do exactly what they do in every respect. But in this case, if people want the, I understand why you want it, and that it's reasonable to do it. It seems like Casey wants to do it. Other people want to do it. So, and maybe we want to do it. But I think of allowing you to disable this kind of behavior, especially if it has an effect on performance, would be worth considering.
Yeah. Go ahead, Casey.
Of all the designs that we've discussed for this seems like the most tractable one by far. I think that the implementation for get earliest marker time should only have to read a single bucket index shard, so it shouldn't be too expensive, at least during the pending state.
Right, but even then, if your site doesn't require it, then you could say, well, skip that. But by default, we could do it. If it seems to perform well, that's good.
Yeah, I could also see a config option to turn it off, but maybe let's see how it works and how much impact it has on performance, and we can go from there.
Sure. I mean, it seems like it's more or less has to, right? It requires at least another hop, another RAID operation to be performed and something else.
Yeah, we could make it perhaps on by default, and then users could opt out or opt in. I guess we could think about it, but yeah, I guess we'll have to see what the actual performance is. But sure, we could make it configurable.
The only caveat here is currently the trimming time is configurable. So somebody kind of puts the configuration to a very high value. This feature then becomes kind of not useful for them. So as a part of that, can we just go as part of if we don't have the status, can we go actually and try to query the destination zones? Like I know by default right now the trimming happens every 20 minutes. So it's only after 20 minutes you will know whether the value will be reflected whether the object is replicated or not.
Yeah, I mean, the value of this feature doesn't come from its speed necessarily. So that's why I think keeping it scaled to the speed of biolog trimming is okay. The value here is persistency and the fact that it's available for all objects. It's good for like bookkeeping. The value will always be there and provides visibility. I don't think this is something clients will be using as part of their workflow necessarily. Like if they're polling an object once a second for 20 minutes to see it's done, I don't think that's the correct usage of this feature. I think that's what notifications are meant to do. So I think having a slower update is okay. And if a user wants to make it faster, they could always give more time to trimming to make it perhaps even quicker. So that's really going to depend on how the user configures their cluster. But I mean, most things performance-based are, right?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to end up in a situation where a bunch of users are polling on a whole bunch of objects. That doesn't seem like a good design.
Yeah, and they have the object sync notifications if they really want a timely.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So if I understand this correctly, doing this, I guess we want to be compliant with what AWS provides for replication status. Is that right?
Yeah, that is sort of the idea, is to make it parallel to what AWS has, as well as, like, it seems like a useful feature for clients as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I guess on that note, though, this doesn't really capture a failed status, right?
Right.
We don't have any way to know whether the sync succeeded or failed.
Yeah.
Most failures would get retried, but stuff like permission errors for the user mode sync just wouldn't be caught. It would show up as completed instead.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what AWS says as well. Not that we need to follow them exactly, but it's mainly permissions that are really going to cause a failed state. Like even if the destination site is down, it still should stay in pending. I looked at, for example, how MinIO, which is sort of S3 adjacent, implements this, and even if they have failed stuff, they still retry it anyway. But they have like more of like a a push-based replication thing, so it's easier to implement failed there. But for our use case, I mean, not really sure how permissions really come into play here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's not easy to produce as it is in those systems. It would be more of a significant error in the setup, right? If it,
right.
for us to have that case, if the pending case, the eventually our application is reliable. If a site goes down, we expect this to eventually complete. So whether there should be an error handling path at all is an open question. But if it were, I can imagine ways to implement that, but you probably don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if a zone is down, then the source won't be trimming its logs until it comes back up and starts making progress again.
So things will just be pending, but that's exactly what you want.
Yeah. I think there's no obvious space for the failed status to come in here. I think my opinion would be all right to omit it, just because the system doesn't really have reliable ways to do that. I'm not sure how AWS would even have permissions fail like that, but I'm no expert there.
Well, you can with CRR you can just tell it to send this over there, I believe, and that as you can in Minio. So those cases would not be uncommon for them.
Right.
Yeah, bucket replication policy also gives you an option to do the replication under an assumed role that might not have permission to everything, and so I think you could see permission errors through that too.
Well, that's an interesting case. It's one case that I hadn't heard of before. But if we want to think about how to tell people about that, I mean, that might be relevant. We should maybe circle back to it.
Yeah, I agree. If anything, we circle back, take a look at it later. But I think the initial goal, at least, is to get these two pending and completed states that I think cover almost all the use cases pretty succinctly.
Yeah, I love it overall. One comment about get earliest marker time.
Right.
Usually you'll only have to read one single shard for the index shard that the given object maps to. But reshard events might complicate that if the writes happen during an older log generation. We would need some way to look back and query the right log shard.
Yeah, I guess that is this is kind of the thing where I wasn't sure of. So yeah, I guess we could look at that shard, but resharding does sort of make it complicated. So do we want to store this as a global variable of just what's the lowest one across all shards? I guess it would be more efficient to just keep it at the shards and try to deal with resharding logic there. I think, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess we could try to throw in some logic there to handle resharding.
Actually, yeah, I think all you need to do is look at the oldest log shard that we have. There's a vector of log generations. So if you look at the oldest one and map the object name to the right shard there, then it should do the right thing.
Got it. Okay, I think that solves that one. So thanks for that. Any other comments?
One question regarding versioned objects. So in this case, for example, the inner if statement, the object modification time, would it be the current versions, or like, I don't know whether it's possible to query an older version object's replication status though. How would this play with the versioned objects basically? My question.
Yeah, so I guess version objects are just objects, I guess with the same name in theory. So they should be added to the bylog. They have different instance IDs, so it's easy to, I guess, differentiate between them. So, and different instances do get replicated. So I would assume it would play the same way, where each instance of versioned objects has its own header or status information.
Yeah, exactly. You can send get or head requests to specific versions. The versions each have their own unique M time, and it's that we would compare against the BI log. So I think everything works fine.
Okay. Last chance for questions, comments. Otherwise, thanks for listening and all the good insights. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yuval, last on the agenda. I'm sorry that we didn't save more time. Do you want to introduce this one, and maybe we can follow up on it offline?
Yeah, this is really a quick one. I had a couple of discussions. I just wanted to explain the change there with the implementation of the Kafka client. So the thing is that my initial thought as for the behavior of the Kafka client library that we're using is that if the broker is down, then eventually I'm going to get an error at request level, just the same way that I get a callback saying the message was delivered. I can get a callback saying the message was not delivered, but this is not the case. So the way that our implementation kind of not entirely well worked so far was that I got the error only due to the connection idle timeout. Now, I have to explain, the connection idle timeout is for long-term idleness cleanup, not for any error handling of any sorts. So the whole point of idle timeout is that if you create topics, and topics can map in a big mash to actual brokers. I don't want to kind of have a very sophisticated reference counting between topics and brokers. And the way that I manage that is that if nobody sends messages to a broker, then after a while, that could be like 30 seconds or 10 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days, doesn't matter. Eventually, after some timeout, I'm just going to kill the connection just so I won't have like an open connection that nobody is using. So, but because it was 30 seconds, then that was kind of an unintended mechanism to restart a connection that was down. With the fix in the PR that I linked in the Etherpad, the main change is that I'm using a different callback from the Kafka library that tells me that there was an error at the connection level, and I manage or retry the connection and do all the work according to that, and not based on the idleness timeout that is a completely different mechanism for completely different reasons. That's the reason for the PR, that the change there. And this is this is specifically important for the case of non-persistent notifications. With persistent notifications, you don't feel the problem so critically because there's the background thread that retries. With non-persistent notifications, this is very critical because you want the failure to be immediate when the broker is down. You want the request to immediately fail if this is your intent. And this is why this fix is important for this use case. If there are any questions, because we're really out of time, please follow up in the PR or send me a message directly on Slack. I'll be happy to reply.
All right. I see that Kernal has been helping with review there. Are you guys on the same page?
Yep, I'll try to post comments on the PR. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks for everybody for sticking around. See you next week.
See you.